Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi. That's right, I decided it was time to take an on-screen persona. And it's that time again. It's midweek, and I want you to play some magic so you can win 2 free rare or better ICRs. This week's Midweek Magic is all about Historic. And while that may sound cut and dry, Historic can be one of the more complicated things we do on Arena. Because if you do it wrong, you spend all your wild cards on a deck that maybe you end up not liking. So we are going to show you the right way to ease into it. This is a very long video, but it is chock full of education and what we here at the Stronghold like to call the good stuff. But before we get into all that, allow me to do the awkward thing and promote the channel. A while back, one of my viewers was kind enough to point out that we are the only channel putting out timely midweek magic content. So be sure to subscribe right here at the Planeswalker Stronghold for all of your future midweek magic needs, because we will be bringing you a deck list or strategy every single week. So what do you say we put all this aside and just get to that? For a while now, I have been teasing that I have a lot of, and I quote, really cool stuff, one of my less articulate moments, in store for my viewers when we hit 500 subs. And since we are coming up on that, I've got the super secret tech for you today, or at least a bit of a preview for those of you who make it all the way to the end of the video. So stay tuned. This video is full of good stuff. As you get more and more time on Arena, you will come to realize, much as I have, that the historic best of one meta just doesn't change all that much. Maybe once or twice a year you have a new deck or a new card significant enough to shake up the meta, but for the most part it kind of just stays the same, with only minor fluctuations of deck popularities and win rates that are basically the expression of the meta. One of the reasons for that is historic can be kind of tough to get into. It can be very wild card intensive. So a lot of those little shifts that you see are because of what's going on in standard that can then translate into historic, as well as the fact that people tend to invest in one or two historic decks and will continue to grow and play those decks pretty much regardless of what's going on in the meta. Mono Green Elves, for instance, has been at the top of the meta for, I think, a year, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, but very, very close. Mono Red of some version is almost always in the top 5. You can pretty much bank on it. The other 3 slots tend to shift around depending, like I said, on what else is going on. One of my goals as a budget-minded content creator is helping you, in particular as new players, budget players, and free-to-play players, is to help you find a historic deck that gives you the most potential and the longest time frame for that deck to be relevant for the lowest relative investment. And if you cycle through all of these decks, and if you were to go through and combine up the various overlapping mono red strategies, goblins, things like that, mono white, Selesnya, that are just over and over and over, you would almost ubiquitously come to a mono blue tempo deck somewhere in the top 15 or so. And that's about where I would put it today if you were to, again, kind of combine up some of these overlapping archetypes. That is more or less always the case that it is, and sometimes it's much, much higher. Sometimes you'll easily see that in top 10 and even as high as top 5. I don't think mono blue tempo has ever been the big dog in historic, at least not for any measurable length of time. but I think right now this is the best deck to be investing in, either as a new player or a new historic player or an ongoing historic player. It is just so underrepresented right now. A lot of people aren't preparing for it in the matchups, and it can be so explosive that you just get wins. And well, isn't that what we're looking for as budget-minded players? In the interest of finding that value, one of the easiest things we can do to break into historic is start with a standard playable deck and just add some historic staples to it. And in that mindset, let's take a look at the most popular mono blue standard option right now. That is the Spells Matter deck. As the name implies, we are starting off with a full suite of Fading Hopes and Considers in the 1-drop slot. Consider also allowing us to draw cards in addition to a pseudo scry effect. Very, very nice. Delver of Secrets is one of only 2 threats in this deck, and of course it's in there because it is overpowered if you're able to flip it early on and start swinging in with that 3/2 flyer. Very, very nice. And the kind of evasive creature that we like generally in a mono blue tempo deck. From there, we've got Syncopate, one of the more versatile counter spells. It is a tax effect, but because of the X taxation, it fits very nicely anywhere in our mana curve and remains relevant throughout the game, whereas some of the other tax options will kind of age poorly in the game. From here, we've got March of Swirling Mists, and while I think this is very much at home in this version of the deck, where you're only running 2 real offensive threats, the ability to phase those out and protect them is very good. I don't think that's the kind of build we're ultimately going to end up with, and a rare of this sort, I think, is just not what we're looking for. Negate, on the other hand, counter target non-creature spell. It's pretty cut and dry, pretty simple. This deck is running 4, but I'm not sure that's where we're going to end up being. Impulse, 3 copies. Keep in mind, this is not a draw. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library. That will not count as a draw trigger in instances where that matters. Make Disappear is a great standard staple counter spell. It fits very nicely into this, where you're not really having to use this on every single threat, so you can kind of leave this in your hand until the time where it matters. Casualty, of course, is a little counterintuitive when we're running so few threats. Let's see. Thirst for Discovery. Don't let Search the Count's Castle fool ya. This is a classic draw spell for 3 mana, draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard a basic land. This version of the deck is running 20 basic lands, and really once you get to 3, 4, 5, you don't need more lands. So you're able to throw away on that and just get some card advantage there. Haughty Djinn, of course, is the other major threat in this deck. An evasive X4 for 3, where the X is equal to the numbers of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. You also have a static ability of instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. That pairs nicely with something like Syncopate, where you can set X higher than what your opponent may be expecting based on your untapped mana. Arati Scorned is another little mana saver. This spell costs 1 blue less to cast if an opponent casts 2 or more spells this turn. It's a little situational. It's very strong. I think this card's going to age well, but I'm not sure it's what we want right here, right now, particularly in the historic environment. When it comes to historic, one thing that is definitely true about mono blue tempo And one of the reasons that it is so successful and such a great entry point is that there's actually multiple versions of the deck that kind of flow in and out of popularity depending upon the meta, and largely based on what is available to standard players, because this is such a good gateway deck that it often morphs around what is in standard. The current version that is in popularity right now, although it's less than 1% of the meta, it's a real sleeper here, is the Spells Matter version of the deck. That is why we are seeing more of a prominence of things like Delver of Secrets, because it's very easy to flip. You also see a single copy of Baral, Chief of Compliance in here, a human wizard for 2 mana, 1/3 stats, legendary, which could have some nice aspects, but I'm not sure is worth it. Text boxed on it, instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast. Whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So there's a lot of good things going on here, but you really only see Burrell in this Spells Matter version of the deck. You won't see him in any of the other mono blue tempo lists, and I really don't think it is a worthwhile card for you to use, all puns intended, a wild card to acquire and add to your collection at this point. There are definitely better things that we can do with that. All right, now let's go through the rest of this deck list and see what other information about the historic environment we can use to our advantage in putting together our own version of the deck. First off, we've got Miscast from M21, a single mana instant, counters instants and sorceries unless the controller pays 3. Very solid spell. If you have these in your collection, there is certainly no problem in running 1 or 2 copies here. I don't know that I would spend any sort of wild card for this. The spell is just not that unique and not very ubiquitous when it comes to the historic environment. For mono blue tempo in particular. Spell Pierce is available for standard and does kind of sort of the same job and casts a wider net in the fact that it can target any non-creature spell, so it gets those pesky enchantments and artifacts, planeswalkers, things like that. Of course, it's only a penalty of 2 as far as the taxation rate, so not quite as good, but I think the fact that it is a broader targeted spell and available in standard, I would run either 1 Miscast if you have it in your collection, or 0, and I think Spell Pierce, the right number here is 2, because it is only taxing for 2 mana. Once you get past like turn 4, the odds of really being able to stop anything with Spell Pierce is pretty unlikely. At best, at that point, what you're doing is preventing them from casting a second spell by putting that tax on their resources. From there, we've got Pteramander. The P is silent, much like in Jordan. But anyway, a 1 mana 1/1 evasive salamander drake. The fact that this guy is not dinosaur just really hurts my soul a little bit. This is one of those cards we're running 4 of in this list. Because obviously they are going again towards that Spells Matter version, and being able to adapt this at a much lower rate and make it a late game threat is a big deal. I'm not sure that that's the direction our version is ultimately going to go, but Pteramander is one of those cards that you see 1 or 2 copies of this in almost every version. And I do think it's going to be worth at least a single wild card for us to put in our decks. From here, we have the Curiosity Suite. Curious Obsession. I think anyone who's watched much with Mono Blue Tempo in particular on my channel is going to be fairly familiar with this card. A 1-mana enchantment, gives a +1/+1 stat boost, and when the creature does combat damage, you get to draw a card. It is a May effect, so if you end up in one of those weird mill situations, you aren't contributing to your own demise if you don't want to. The thing that sets Curious Obsession apart from other cards like this is you have to attack. It doesn't have to be the creature who is obsessed, but one of your creatures has to attack. If for some reason you forget, Curious Obsession goes away at the end of your turn. So make sure not to play a Curious Obsession in your second main phase, because it will immediately go away unless you have already attacked with one of your creatures. Curiosity, of course, is the, I don't know if it's fair to call this the fixed version. I honestly don't remember which one came first. But Curiosity, it is very much like Curious Obsession, except it is only granting that when this creature does damage, you may draw a card. Very similar, all about that card advantage. You want to play something like Pteramander on turn 1, then on turn 2, make it curious in some manner, and then start swinging for the fences. You're dealing early evasive damage, and you're getting card advantage. Always good things. Siren Stormtamer, another 1-drop evasive creature that Mono Blue Tempo is absolutely in love with. This is a Siren Pirate Wizard. Say that 3 times fast. A 1/1 flying. The thing that sets this apart and makes it unique in the deck, not only does it have some nice creature types in both Pirate and Wizard that are relevant in Blue and Historic, the fact that you can tap 1 mana and sacrifice this creature, counter target spell or ability that targets you or a creature you control. So it's a counter spell with wings. And notice you don't have to tap the Siren itself in order to activate this ability. So even if it's swung last turn, it can still help defend your, say, Pteramander that is leveled up with Curiosity. Very good thing. It is an uncommon, but one that's well worth it. I think this is a good investment of a wild card, depending upon how many others that we end up wanting to do for this deck. From here, we've got a standard favorite, Fading Hope. Nice little bounce effect. If you have very recently come into Arena and you don't have these in your collection just yet, don't forget Unsummon is in your new player experience. Historic is an alchemy-based format, so you can run those in place of this. Obviously, I think Fading Hope is better because of the potential scry effect, because you're often bouncing something with a mana value 3 or less. But it is an alternative for those of you who maybe don't have the Fading Hopes in your collection. And in some cases may never have Fading Hopes in your collection because maybe that Innistrad Midnight Hunt is not an ideal set for you to draft. But anyway, moving on, we've got our boy Spectral Sailor. Another creature, 1-drop. This can flash in at the end of your turn to get away from those desperate turn 1 removal effects that sometimes red and black decks run. It is evasive with flying. And it has a nice onboard mana sink of 3 and a blue, draw a card. That can be very nice for mid-game in the instance that maybe you need to pump a creature by drawing a second card in other versions of the deck, as well as just more and more card advantage. Not that this deck hurts for that at all. A null is in here, counter target artifact or enchantment. And while that sounds really good, a null is not currently available in standard, and I just don't think it's quite broad enough to warrant even a common wild card. If you have it in your collection, if that's the type of deck that you're running into, I think it's a decent enough thing. I wouldn't fault you for putting it in there. But again, we are running multiple copies of Spell Pierce here, which hits the same targets plus a broader spectrum, and does so very effectively in those early turns, despite being attacks over a hard counter. And in a tempo deck, it's those early plays that are going to make the difference. So I would not run the Annul in a historic deck I was building today, again, unless you already have it or you find that it's particularly good in the matchups that you're facing. Delver of Secrets, one of Standard's favorite wizards at the moment, a 1-drop, which is what these decks are so much about. Unfortunately, it's not evasive unless you're able to flip it, showing an instant or sorcery off the top of your deck. Of course, in the version that we're seeing here, that is very, very spell heavy, you are very likely to do that. But don't forget, Curious Obsession, Curiosity, these are enchantments, and there are a lot of slots in this deck and won't flip your Delver of Secrets. That having been said, I do think 2 copies here is the right number for at least a standard base deck, and we'll see how the historic shapes out. From there, I think we have one of the best mono blue counter spells of recent years, Lofty Denial, 2 mana, counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. If you control a flying creature, which mono blue tempo is trying to do anyway, its controller pays 4 instead, so Lofty Denial stays relevant much, much longer for Spell Pierce, and that's why you see 4 copies in this list. I'm not sure that as a new fledgling mono blue tempo in historic player that I would spend 4 wildcards on this, but certainly 1 is going to be a good investment and something I don't think you'll regret. This card is also awesome in blue-white skies for historic. So it is a card you're eventually going to want 4 of. I'm just not sure I'd go all in today. From there, we've got a standard card, Malevolent Hermit, a wizard, blue, sacrifice it, counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 3. So this is basically a better version of Siren Stormtamer. But if you don't already have this, it's a rare wild card that I don't think I would spend for historic purposes. I feel much better about the recommendation of the Siren Stormtamer for an uncommon wild card to do probably 95% of the work. The other reason you see Malevolent Hermit in some of these lists is because when it disturbs, let me see here. Nope, we can't show it, I don't think. Wait, here we go. So it does become a spirit when it flips, and of course the spirit version of the deck is a big thing as recently as last year for versions of Mono Blue Tempo in both historic and in standard. And let's move into column 3 and wrap up this discussion here. Make Disappear is a really standout standard legal instant counterspell with its casualty ability, almost certainly making this a hard counter in the early game as opposed to a soft counter. The casualty effect, however, kind of goes against what we're trying to do of hitting those early creatures and then sticking them with a curiosity style effect and riding that all the way to victory. Also, it comes from Streets of New Capenna, which is a set that I have actively discouraged new players from drafting. So I think asking for 4 copies in a deck like this from me would be highly hypocritical. And if you don't have any, I wouldn't worry about it. There's certainly other good counter magic options available to us in both standard and historic. If you do have them, I'd say 2 copies is probably pretty good. But again, because of some of the counter synergies going on here, I don't know that I'd worry about running really any copies of that. We talked about Burrell, but that brings us to a Brazen Borrower, the only real 3-drop in the entire deck. It's fantastic. If you have them, you absolutely should run them. This is mono blue tempo in a single card. It's absurdly ridiculous. It is, however, a mythic. So I think we're way too early in the budget season to talk about spending our mythic wild card. But again, if you have these, absolutely run them. We are running 2 in this particular list that we're looking at. I think that is a very solid number and an attainable goal. But I certainly would not fault anyone from running more if they had them. Although I think in this deck, going beyond 3 is probably overkill, and you're going to end up with that potentially multiple copies sitting in your hand for no good reason. The final card in this deck is Sea-Dasher Octopus, a 3-mana 2/2. The nice thing about this is the mutate ability, and if you haven't been on Arena for the last couple of years, mutate might not be a thing that you're totally familiar with, but when you cast a creature for its mutate cost, it kind of works like an enchantment and modifies the creature that you are playing it on. The octopus can be the primary creature and the other creature becomes the enchantment. But in essence, you're adding this ability to all of the pre-existing abilities on the creature. So the nice thing here is it has flash. So you can do it either mid-combat or at the end of their turn. If you were holding mana open, say for a counter spell, and they ended up not doing anything, you can flash this in, and then it and its accompanying creature is ready to swing. You can also just play this in as a creature as opposed to mutating another creature, giving you a diversified threat board going on. But just like the other curiosity effects, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Please note, this is not the typical May ability. You must do it, so use that. Keep that in mind if you're playing against that oddball mill deck that sometimes you see in Historic. But the fact that you can make one of your 1-drops now a 2/2 base and give it that curiosity effect, very, very strong card. It is a rare. I do think it's worth a wild card. Having 1, potentially even 2 of these, depending upon the other nature of your collection, very worthwhile. I'm recommending a single wild card for new players, and maybe an additional wild card for those that were around in earlier seasons that have already picked up a copy of this, or maybe have invested a wild card in this one earlier time. As recently as early August, we did an artisan version of Mono Blue Tempo for a midweek Magic event. And, well, even though that was only a little over a month ago, the fact is that was a different time. There is a lot more new people just after rotation than there are just before rotation. Rotation, of course, is when most people start playing Arena for the first time because they're joining at a new season. That, of course, has its ups and its downs. But the reality is, I know there's a lot more new viewers watching this today than there was back on August 9th, I believe it was. At any rate, some of the recommendations that I made then would not necessarily apply now. For instance, Mist-Cloaked Herald is a fantastic card. It's a very strong merfolk. But now that we know what is coming out, not this year, but next year and the year after, we know that there is a very high chance that that will get reprinted. Similarly, Brineborn Cutthroat, Departed Deckhand, Merfolk Trickster, and even Faceless Agent, as it ties into those tribal synergies a bit more. All of those cards are much more likely to get reprinted, not spring 23, but spring of 2024. The point of this deck was also to show a lot of options and different ways that you could go with this, i.e. the versatility of mono blue tempo. So things like Bind the Monster and Bubble Snare are different directions you can go, much like Sleep of the Dead, but aren't necessarily where you want to go for every single build. On the other hand, cards like Opt, we absolutely want to include our one free copy of Opt that we got through the code SuperScry. If you don't know what I'm talking about with codes, you owe it to yourself to go check out my comprehensive codes video. Obviously, Curious Obsession is a very strong card. The entire Curiosity suite is probably well worth considering. Use your wild cards as best you can, but eventually, if you are going to get serious about mono blue tempo, you are going to want full play sets of the entire suite. Spectral Sailor, another very strong card. I think it's worth a wild card. It fits as an evasive 1-drop, it allows for card draw, and it has flash to allow you to play it on your opponent's turn, which is good with things like Brineborn Cutthroat. Even though we probably aren't running Cutthroat today, having Spectral Sailor in your arsenal makes Brineborn Cutthroat better when you are running it. Lastly, Jawari Disruption as a land and a counter spell is almost a requirement to play blue in Historic. Alright, so when you take that plethora of information, you throw it in a pot and you simmer it on a medium-low heat for approximately 34 minutes, you should come up with something vaguely like this. And I have the screen set up a little differently. The first column is your card draw, card advantage package. Your second column here is your disruption package, and then the last column, of course, are threats. Because eventually we do have to win the game. We can't count on all of our opponents to just concede. Let's take a closer look here. Combat Research, of course, is one of the main inspirations of this deck. As far as a time and a place, it's the closest thing we have seen to Curious Obsession in quite a while. The only real disappointment to this is that we're not really running any legendary creatures to make use of that. Hadi Djinn, of course, not legendary. From there, we've got a 4-pack of Considers, Curiosity, and a Curious Obsession. I highly recommend having at least one of each of those in your collection. More will be better over time. Opt, of course, we're going to run that because we got it for free using the code SuperScry. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you owe it to yourself to go check out my comprehensive codes video. It will change the way you think about the economy of the game. From there, we've got Spectral Sailor. He is both card draw and a potential threat as an early 1-drop evasive. It has flash that comes into play in several different areas or other builds of the deck. Impulse is actually one of the cards I would consider cutting because it is not an actual draw trigger. You're just putting a card into your hand. Technicalities, what can I tell you? Thirst for Discovery, we're running 2 copies on that. Draw 3 cards, then discard 2 cards unless you discard a basic land card. So this is an instant, and I believe because you are drawing 3 cards, it will actually trigger things like your Fairy Vandal when you draw your second card each turn. So since it's an instant, you can actually trigger Fairy Vandal on your opponent's turn and get more mileage. Sea-Dasher Octopus, we talked about this. This is the rare wildcard recommendation for this deck. It is another draw trigger and a potential threat in its own right. Moving on to Disruption, we have the 4 copies of Fading Hope. It's not a draw, but there is the scry potential to set up future draws. Shore Up is just a nice way to protect a limited body of threats. Spell Pierce, Jawari Disruption, Make Disappear, Negate, and Syncopate, of course, are just counter spells of various types. Feel free to play with the quantities on those depending upon what's in your collection. I do highly recommend that Jawari Disruption as a wildcard usage for growing your historic collection if you are going to be a blue mage there. In the threats, we've talked about Delver of Secrets. Pteramander is another one of those early potential threats that can have a nice, strong late game finish due to the Adapt 4. Of course, by the time we can cast that Adapt ability, we're going to have lots of instants and sorceries in our graveyard, making it even more achievable. Fairy Vandal is a nice, early, evasive flash threat that gets bigger and bigger every time we draw our second card for the turn. Ledger Shredder is another one of those early evasive threats. It also gets bigger when we cast our second spell. Honestly, I like Fairy Vandal better than Ledger Shredder. Ledger Shredder and Honey Djinn are the two rares in the deck that are from Standard. I think it is a fair expectation that you'd have access to these without use of wild cards. Even though they're not part of the new player experience, they are both represented in the highest tier of jump-in options, and if you're playing jump-in correctly, it's not hard to think you have at least one copy of one, if not both of these. And of course, we wrap things up with 21 islands. And to start wrapping things up, looking at the deck from another perspective, all of the cards on the left-hand side of your screen are available through your standard grind play style. There's nothing there that should require any sort of wild card. On the right-hand side of the screen are the things that I think are worth picking up and adding to your historic collection. Sea-Dasher Octopus is your rare recommendation again. Curiosity and Curious Obsession. If you can't do both, I would do Curious Obsession. Pteramander is a fantastic card, fits very nicely into current builds. If you don't have the wild cards for it, this is one of the ones that I would let go for the time being, as is Spectral Sailor. Eventually, you're going to want both of these cards for your blue tempo options, but if today is not the day, do the best you can. Jawari Disruption, again, I think is almost a mandatory card for blue mages in Historic. The fact that it is a land and really has no opportunity cost in your deck building makes it a real winner. And of course, Opt, we talked about that code Super Scry. Don't miss out on the Super Scrying opportunities there and get your copy today. Now, whether this is just not quite your speed, or maybe you have a deeper collection of Historic already, or you've already built mono blue tempo to your satisfaction, I've got some super secret tech for you here that is going to show you a multitude of additional options for this week's midweek magic. So allow me to take this opportunity to introduce the MtG Arena formats and deck building resources over on my blog. That's right, I've got a blog. Some of you may or may not know that. But at any rate, we've got a very brief explanation of the various formats that are available on MtG Arena, as well as hot links to list you to either appropriate resources on YouTube, i.e. playlists featuring that format, or the brand new thing that is just now taking shape. Under Historic, we have a hot link over to Aetherhub, and well, I'll show you that over there. When you get over to Aetherhub, you're going to find a Historic folder set up with, well, today 20 decks of Historic nature, most of which are budget, whether they be artisan or just a more conservative budget build, including your rares. All of these decks I have been running for years and highly recommend. The wonderful thing about this is as we hit that 500 sub mark and I'm able to solidify a more significant partnership with Aetherhub, more things like this are going to come up. Not only will we have deck lists for essentially every single format over here in plethora, because we have been doing this YouTube thing here for a couple of years, and there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that you don't even know about. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the Aetherhub, let's take a look here at, well, let's go with Zombie-Geddon. This is one of my favorite decks, and still, I think the cheapest deck you can build on Arena. Of course, you've got link backs to the deck tech videos as needed, as well as a downloadable deck list for MTG format, as well as MTG Online, or text embedded, or PDF formats, all really awesome. I happen to like the visual cue, and that's right. This is the whole deck right here. Awaken the Erstwhiles is a single rare. Treasure Hunt, I believe, is a common on Arena, despite the artwork showing a little differently here. Then you got a bunch of islands and 2 copies of Reliquary Tower and a handful of swamps. So for 3 commons, 2 uncommons, and 1 rare, you can have what I think is a really fun to play historic deck. And if that's not your cup of tea, we've got 19 more here for you. So I encourage you to explore this, and as we get closer to 500, we'll be adding in the Brawl section. I think is going to be up next, and that's just a tip of the iceberg of what our community will unlock as we continue to approach and surpass 500 subs on the YouTube channel.
What's that? You didn't catch all that? Well, Matt would like you to know that any deck list applicable to this video can be found down in the doobly-doo. Hey, let's not forget, the whole reason to participate in these totally free midweek Magic events is the prize support is awesome. And don't forget, if this video gets just 10 likes by 8 p.m. tonight on the day of release, I will be live playing this on my Twitch channel. And with all that having been said, don't forget, smash that like button like Ronnie J would. And until next time, I'll see you in the arena.